Okay, so I'm finally getting around to making my series of videos that's going to be explaining the truth about One Punch Man. I'm going to be starting with this one, explaining who Saitama actually is, or more so what he is based off of, and that will show us what the overall series is about and where it's headed. It's going to take me many videos to explain all of this stuff, so please subscribe because, over the next couple weeks I'm going to be releasing them. So let's just get it out there immediately. Saitama is the Egyptian god of the sun, Ra, and he kind of always was. And more so, the story of One Punch Man was always kind of the myth of Osiris in a way. It's not a one-for-one recreation, of course, just similar in the way that like Naruto and One Piece aren't one-for-one recreations of Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, but it's more or less kind of following the same path. And there is some Tale of the Bamboo Cutter in One Punch Man as well, but it also ties back to the myth of Osiris and just Egyptian mythology in general. So first, let me just give you Wikipedia's description of Ra, and that way I could further expand upon how he is Saitama and how Saitama is him. So Ra was the Egyptian deity of the sun. He had become one of the most important gods in Egyptian religion, identified primarily with the noonday sun. Ra was believed to rule in all parts of the created world, the sky, the earth, and the underworld. He was the god of the sun, order, kings, and the sky. Since the people regarded Ra as a principal god, creator of the universe and source of life, he had a strong influence on them, which led to him being one of the most worshipped of all Egyptian gods and even considered king of the gods. At an early period in Egyptian history, his influence spread throughout the whole country, bringing multiple representations in form and in name. The most common form combinations are with Atum, his human form, and Khepri, the scarab beetle, and Horus, the falcon. So let's just stop there for a second. So the most obvious example of this is King. King is Atum and Saitama's human form. And I've obviously been talking about this for years, and it was right in front of my face the whole time. Notice how I've always been saying that Saitama and King are two sides of the same coin. They both represent absolute power. King is who everyone sees as absolute power. However, Saitama is literally the absolute power. And of course, this was always purposely crafted by one, but the more significant meaning is this. Ra is a god who goes by many names, and that is why King's name is King, because, Saitama is like the true king. They're the king of gods, just like how Ra was. Also, another reason why all of Saitama's huge feats in the beginning of the series are associated with King. Defeating Vaccine Man, defeating Beefcake, etc. This is also why the sequence of Saitama meeting King plays out the way that it does. When we see King before he becomes an S-class hero, he's encountered by the Octopus Claw Man. But if you'll look closer, you'll see that the Octopus Claw Man represents the moon, and his left eye is being slashed. That's because the left represents the eye of Horus, and the right represents the eye of Ra. But I'll get more into the eye symbology in a little bit. But also, when King is saved by Saitama, he is first seen with the sun glaring behind him, the light coming down on King. Now, Khepri, on the other hand, is a little more ambiguous to the story, but it does make sense, and I think this will be more prevalent in future developments that are actually currently happening right now, and we'll come back to Khepri, but right now I'll just say that he's very likely to be Zombie Man, and I know that sounds far-fetched, like, Zombie Man, he's not really that important. Well, maybe not right now, but it's very likely that he is going to become extremely important later on in the story, and more so heavily tied to Saitama. But like I said, I'll come back to Khepri because there actually is symbology for him, just like there is symbology for many things in this story, and it's pretty cool. So going back to Ra, on top of his head sits a solar disc with a cobra, which in many myths represent the eye of Ra. Okay, let's stop there. So as we can see, this is how Ra is depicted. Falcon's head with the sun on top. This symbology has always been present to us within the series. In fact, it's been present even before One Punch Man was a thing, because some of you hardcores out there know that one's like original kind of story for this was called Taiyo Man, and Taiyo means sun, sun man. Ra god of the sun. And I'm pretty sure that's why Saitama is bald, to represent the sun. That's like it. That's like the main reasoning behind it. I mean, aside from that, just being bald makes him iconic and stick out from the rest of the cookie cutter manga heroes. But it more so just represents that he is Ra, the god of the sun. And another way that one cleverly shows us this is back in the martial arts tournament. When Saitama puts on his Shiranko wig, that is representing the sun, and that he is Ra. Also, when Saitama takes up the name of Shiranko in that tournament, it goes back to Ra being a god who goes by many names. And just a little side note here, another symbology that we see in the martial arts tournament is Garo wearing the Wolfman mask. That is meant to represent that he is Anubis. And yes, I'll talk about him in another video, as well as all of the other S-class heroes and characters in this series who are based on Egyptian gods. It does not stop with Saitama, King, and Zombie Man. It goes much, much deeper than that. But also the Eye of Ra is mentioned here. And if you follow my videos, you know lately I've been talking about how one uses left and right symbology, especially with the eyes, and this is where it's coming from. Right eye represents the eye of Ra, which, you know, is the good, the light, the sun, Saitama, as where the left eye is the eye of Horus. That represents the moon, bad things, darkness, and God, like the character from One Punch Man. Again, I'll be explaining all of this in much further detail later on in another video. Just that right there should already be able to show you the truth about most of these characters, and that's because we see the singular eye represented so much within this series. And whenever you see that, it is for sure telling us that they are a disciple of God because they are bearing the eye of Horus. Now, which characters exhibit these eyes? Well, Boros, of course. That's because Boros was always kind of in one's mind. I mean, you could see that he was a part of Taio Man originally with the whole 20 years too strong villain thing. And I've been talking about this for a long time, that Boros is connected to God in some way, and he pretty much is, and I'll explain that later. But the most prominent singular eye that we see is Drive Knight. That's because Drive Knight is Horus. But Drive Knight, aka Horus, is just ultimately a disciple of Osiris, who is God. Goes back to the myth of Osiris. And that's just what this whole series comes down to. The sun versus the moon. Saitama versus God. You've probably heard me say in, I don't know, a few videos or something that I really like One Punch Man because I feel like it's like the perfect fusion of Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. You get like the one-dimensional strong fighting guys aspect of Dragon Ball Z combined with the three-dimensional aspects of One Piece with world building, character development, and extensive lore. But little did I know I was much closer to the truth than I actually knew, because they're both telling the same story, which is just the sun versus the moon. One Piece ultimately comes down to sun god Nika versus the moon goddess Imu. And it just doesn't stop there. I guess this is really the origin of all storytelling, because the sun and the moon obviously have always been a thing as long as humanity has been around. The sun gives light, brings the day, brings life, but when the moon comes out, then the darkness comes and it takes away the light and the sun goes away. Brings fear, other things like that. So the age-old story of humanity has always been the sun versus the moon, or the light versus the dark. But back to the Ra mythology. Ra was believed to have created all forms of life by calling them into existence by uttering their secret names. In some accounts, humans were created from Ra's tears and sweat. And we actually do see this happening in chapter 86, which is, I guess, the most important chapter in the series, possibly, next to like chapter 22. So in that chapter, we see Dr. Genus explaining the limiter and just monsters in general to Zombie Man. Remember, it could be Kepri. And this also again shows the genius of one's writing, because he is literally telling us the truth here, but he's just disguising it as like normal dialogue. So when he's explaining the limiter to Zombie Man, he says, no matter how much an organism strives, there are limits to its growth. An overabundance of strength is a burden to its bearer. For that reason, God has designed each creature to grow within parameters that allow for survival and preservation of reason, and the mechanism for controlling that growth is called a limiter. So that statement right there has obviously been talked about and dissected for years, and I personally have been asked, like, is Dr. Genus talking about the God character there. And I always thought, like, well, no, because how would Dr. Genus know about God? And if he did, he would just tell Zombie Man. And this goes back to one telling us the truth, but disguising it as just normal, harmless dialogue. Dr. Genus, the character himself, is just saying God as, like, you know, nature or whatever. But one himself literally means God, the character here, aka Osiris, because God has literally done this to all of the organisms, I think pretty much in the universe, maybe. I'm not really sure how far his reach goes at this point, but we have gotten some more insight into that with Blast's Green Lantern Corps thing. But God has done this. He has put a limiter onto living beings so that they can only become so strong as to where they cannot challenge him the way that Saitama eventually will. And in another video, I'll explain how he has done this, because that too has been shown to us. The reason why people become monsters and the way that God's system has been imposed on, I guess, most life-bearing planets. And that too is pretty genius how one did it. But going further, Dr. Genus says regarding Saitama, but that man, he forced himself beyond his boundaries and thereby succeeding in removing his limiter, and he suffers suffocating isolation. After he defeated my greatest warrior with a single punch, the look on his face told it all. And Carnage Kabuto is actually kind of important too, because it goes back to the whole Khepri thing. The most common Ra form combinations are with Atum, King, his human form, and Khepri, the scarab beetle, along with Horus the falcon. Now, what was Carnage Kabuto originally referred to as? The ultimate life form. Obviously, it was not him. The ultimate life form is Saitama. And also, in this chapter, we see a little hanging ornament thing of Carnage Kabuto. And in the final page of Dr. Genus's exposition here, we see it hanging over Zombie Man's head. And Khepri is often represented as a scarab holding aloft the morning sun, or a scarab-headed man. And I won't really go too much into spoilers here, but it's not a coincidence what's going on with Zombie Man right now in the webcomic, especially since Khepri is associated with being the god of resurrection. But anyway, going further, Zombie Man says, I know many monsters who disregard their strength limits. When they don't become actual monsters, the world calls them heroes. And then Dr. Genus says, when humans become monsters, there's an explosion of frustration resulting from unsatisfied desires and the urge to transform. Driven by destructive behaviors and psychological complexes, the individual's past circumstances and other factors may give rise to cellular abnormalities and spontaneous mutation. These are reborn as new creatures, but they retain their limiters. Broadly speaking, the sea folk who attacked City J and the aliens who attacked City A were also monsters, but they were natural creatures with an innate animosity towards humankind. Again, Boros is shown here with the Eye of Horus. He is for sure a product of God in some way. It's not a coincidence that he was sent to Earth, especially with the alien seer looking Lovecraftian, similar to how Orochi does. But then going further, he says, by contrast, heroes work hard to develop innate talents, thereby acquiring the incredible powers that allow them to stand against monsters. And then he goes on to talk about Saitama some more, and he says, but he was different. He was a normal person of ordinary birth with an ordinary lifestyle and no particular talent. Yet through sheer effort, he forced open his limits and demolished his limiter. Now, what do we see in this panel right here? Saitama sweating, and he has a tear coming from his eye. Going back to what we talked about with Ra, man was created from Ra's tears and sweat. Saitama's tears and sweat, which he gave for many days in order to remove his limiter, gave birth to someone who was strong enough to overcome God and stop the cycle, therefore giving birth to the true humans who are no longer under the influence of God's system. This is, of course, the end result of the series, but that's where I want to end the video because I don't know how long it's going to be at this point, but like I said, there's so much more that I need to talk about, and I'll just give you a little preview as to what's to come. I'm going to talk about the truth about Drive Knight, of course, about how he is the most significant villain in the series outside of God. Going to be explaining God himself because he has a whole other rabbit hole powerful to him, and it's actually been shown to us in the series the truth about him and where the story is headed with him as well. Also going to be talking about the Psychic Sisters and which one of them is going to wind up being with Saitama. Yes, that's going to be a thing. Going to be talking more about Psychos, Orochi, talking more about Genos and Metal Knight and Drive Knight, and how all three of their storylines are going to converge in a pretty cool way. And of course, in that video, I'll explain why Metal Knight wasn't a villainous traitor the whole time and where his base is actually located, probably. Also, why people become monsters and the system that God has put in place. And then eventually, I'll be explaining what the next big arc of One Punch Man is going to be, which is already kind of being set up right now in the webcomic, and why Drive Knight and Psychos are going to defeat Saitama. Yes, it is going to happen, but I mean, he'll come back and win eventually, but there will be a point where he is defeated. So yeah, if you like the video, guys, just please subscribe and, you know, have a good day.